Shouldn't forget. I'm going to say, hi everybody, thanks for being with us. I am going to turn things over to Dr. Alicia Schatteman, the Director of the Center for Nonprofit and Non-Governmental Studies at Northern Illinois University. Welcome, thank you.
Yes, that was great to be here. And actually, it's been an interesting week. We just had graduation last Saturday, so it seems a little calmer now. It's kind of nice, and it's fun to get together with some folks who are from the nonprofits from all other regions. I love visiting, at least virtually. We're gonna have to keep this going. We started doing this during COVID, but I kind of like it, so we'll keep it going. So when Sam and I were chatting about topics, things like that, she thought, well, let's think about a topic around community surveys. So this is a research kind of interest for sure. I teach undergraduate as well as graduate courses in nonprofit management, typically financial management, performance management, strategic planning. Those are kind of my three things. But as part of that, obviously, you have to do a lot of research. So let's kick it off. All right, I'm working on 3 screens today. Like one isn't bad enough, right? So some objectives for today is to kind of talk about the variety of methods available for conducting community surveys. Hopefully it'll build some of your skills and knowledge about what techniques you can use. Understand a little bit about the methodology and how that relates to decision making. I won't get into a heavy stats class because that doesn't bring me joy either. And then kind of go through a little bit of things to think about when you're designing surveys themselves. Okay, so I took this straight from Sam's description. Why survey? When do you survey? Who do you survey? How do you survey? And then what comes after your survey? So I'm going to use the exact same framework. But to start, I think it's really important to think about kind of 3 types of data that exist in any organization, and that's administrative, secondary, and primary data. So what does that mean? Your data, administrative data might be some records that you keep just as a result of doing what you do, basically. So you could have logs, reports, records, that can be financial information. It could be client, customer, patron use of your services, whatever that happens to be. Reports that you regularly file, minutes, any kind of information that your organization is collecting by virtue of you carrying out your mission. So those are things that aren't, you don't have to, go and collect them specifically for a research purpose. You're already doing that. The good thing about administrative data is you already have it. It also tends to be very accurate. You're not asking people about their use. You actually have use data just by virtue of collecting the data that you have, whether that's people logging in, swiping a card, entering a code, walking through a door, all of those kinds of things. So administrative data is actually preferred if you have that type of data. It's preferred over asking people for data because it tends to be way more accurate. Sometimes there are some difficulties with administrative data. Often systems don't talk to each other. So this system might collect this kind of data, this system might collect this kind of data, but they actually don't link together. So doing some kind of analysis can be a little tricky. Or they're not tied to an individual, for example, whatever it happens to be. So it's not perfect, but it is easy in that you have already collected it. Secondary data, and if there are any librarians on the call, you guys are well versed in secondary data. So that's just data that's been collected by other agencies or programs for a different purpose. And the secondary data we often think about first is the census data. So federal government collecting that every 10 years, and everything is publicly accessible. Good and the bad, somebody else paid for that, somebody else collected it, so there's no cost to you to do it. Downside is sometimes, well, they didn't ask the question the way you wanted it, they didn't collect the right kind of data that's useful to you. It's not at the level of use to you, so you can get it to a city level or a county, but it's not by block, not particular to your organization, that kind of thing. So it can be very efficient because the data has already been collected. There is also tends to be a lag with secondary data. So it might have been collected 4 years ago, and then there was analysis, and then it was released to the public. So there's a lag between actually data collection and when you have available. So the focus really for today is really to talk about primary data collection, because if you have administrative data and that doesn't fit your needs, you have some secondary data, but it isn't exactly what you need, or you don't have it available yet, then you're going to have to look at primary data collection. And so that's just data or information that's been collected for the first time by whoever's collecting it, by a researcher or whoever. And it can be in all different forms. Survey is just one of them, but it can be polls or interviews or focus groups or all kinds of different things. But this data just hasn't been collected by anybody else. And then I'll talk about kind of why people would participate. There's some research in here about why people participate in primary data collection, why they want to attend a focus group or fill out a survey. And some of the data, and this is really coming from psychology mostly, is that the reasons why people participate is that the costs really have to be minimized. And that's just not money, it can be time or effort. You really have to try to minimize that as much as possible and maximize rewards. So sometimes there's incentives or disincentives. So if you make people travel a long distance, for example, in order to attend a focus group, they're probably going to be like, it's not worth it. Or you have to pay for parking, or it's over, your lunch hour and you don't want to give that up, or whatever the case is. So your participation rates is really driven by those things. How can we minimize the cost to participate, and what kind of rewards can we put in place? And rewards don't have to be monetary. They certainly can be things like gift cards. But sometimes it's just the ability, the ease in which it is to participate, and there's some kind of benefit for that. The other reason why people would participate is they have an interest in the subject, topic, organization to participate. So likely the people who are going to participate already have a relationship with the organization. Tends to be a higher level of trust. And so that is often behind why they would participate. Another reason that comes up in the research is they feel bad if they don't help and they feel good if they do help. So they're making a difference. They feel like they're contributing. It's their responsibility, maybe as a citizen, a resident, a member, whatever that case happens to be. Another big reason why people participate is around they actually believe that their opinion matters. So it kind of comes back to that trust idea. There's probably a relationship there. They've maybe participated in the past and they feel like their voice was taken into consideration, that kind of thing. It's a challenge then for those individuals who have participated in the past and they did not feel that way. It's going to be very hard to attract them again to participate. And the final reason is people might be like, well, I don't have anything better to do, and it's convenient. So things like you're standing in line and they hand you a 3-question survey and you're not doing anything else, you're just standing there. So you're like, okay, I'll fill out 3 questions. That's kind of easy. So kind of keep those reasons in the back of your mind, because everything that we talk about today is really going to come back to why would somebody give me their thoughts, opinions when I ask for it, typically in a survey. The other thing to keep in mind is, so who is most likely to participate? And this is kind of social science broadly, which is my background, public administration, nonprofit management, that kind of thing. If you look at survey responses, when it comes to this kind of research, surveys, focus groups, they tend to be middle-aged, white, college-educated women. I could have put my picture up there. Those are the folks who tend to participate. Now, if that's your target audience, you're great. If it's not, if you're trying to do broad community surveys and you want representativeness from, young, youth, all the way through older adults, and you want it to be a mix of gender, a mix of race, a mix of ethnicity, you're going to have to work pretty hard against this because these are the individuals who tend to participate. There's lots of research assistance available. So I'm going to give you some things as we chat today. There's a survey research and data visualizations here at NIU at the Center for Governmental Studies. So they have a team of folks. I'm a party of 3. But they do have teams that can help you if you're just thinking about doing a survey. or are looking for some assistance when it comes to actually doing the design. You can maybe carry it out, but you're not really sure of where to start. So just kind of another resource. So why survey then? So I've given you a little bit of background about the purpose of primary data collection, why you might want to turn to that, but why specifically survey? So here's some kind of pros and cons. On the pro side, you can get the exact information that you want. If it's really important to you to know how many pets are in their household, I don't know, I'm making that up, then you could ask a survey question that's exactly what you need. So you can get straightforward information. Another pro is you really want your results to be generalizable to a larger population. So we're in DeKalb County here. They're looking to do a food security audit. They really want to be able to survey or sample the population across the county so that they are able to say 25% of our households are food insecure or whatever. They really want to be able to generalize to that county-wide population. Survey, you can get broad input. Again, if you structure it correctly, that's possible. It tends to be inexpensive when it comes to delivering a survey. There's always going to be an expense of time. So if you factor in time, then that's a little bit different, but it's an inexpensive method. It can be efficient. So if you are focusing on an online survey, for example, and you can, you have a target population and you know where they are and there's high trust already, you can turn an online survey around pretty quickly. In a couple of weeks, you can be done, versus you're putting it out into the community and it's going to be in multiple locations and it's going to be online, paper, and whatever else. And then, so there's different types of survey deployment, and that's we'll talk about that, but that's a pro because you can distribute it in multiple ways. On the negative side, we often, when we're given surveys, we either may not answer correctly, not because we're necessarily trying to be dishonest, but we're trying to be socially desirable answers, and I'll give you some examples. People can skip any questions that they want, so there's no reason for them to complete a survey 100%, and that's one of the things when you're analyzing surveys. You'll notice, response rate to this one question is very high, and the next question is really, really low. There's nothing you can do about that. People will fill out the survey the way they want and skip questions they don't like or skip questions they don't understand, whatever. There can be interpretation issues, especially if you haven't taken enough time to really think through your questions. If you're asking them in the correct way, how do I interpret that? There's lack of nuance in survey questions because you can't ask follow-up questions or what did you mean by that when somebody writes in an answer, for example. You can have data analysis issues depending on your skills or background. You may not know how to analyze every type of survey question. You can't often personalize the survey. So if you're doing an online survey, for example, you can do things like, if this doesn't apply to you, skip, and it'll automatically skip to the next section. So that's kind of nice with an online survey versus a paper survey. There can be accessibility issues, whether that is language, whether that is font size, whether that is online versus offline. So there's those kind of issues to keep in mind. In general, where we kind of suffer from a little bit of survey fatigue, there's everywhere you go now, I think when you check out even of most retail places, tell us how we did, make sure you complete the survey. Would you mind answering a couple of surveys? Or when you get a service call to your house and they, immediately follow up with a phone call saying, how did we do? So it does take time and effort to give, all of these responses. It can be challenging to get a representative sample, and we'll talk about that, of how to do that. And then just kind of overall low response rates. So we just came, like I said, we just finished out our semester here, our spring semester, and we do course evaluations, which is a survey, and we do them online because it's efficient, and we know who our students are, and we can send out multiple reminders, and it still can be very low response rates, and there's really not a lot we can do. We follow up, but it is what it is. And feel free, Sam, if somebody has a question or you want to stop me, let me know. Okay. So go ahead, Sam.
Nothing so far, but
okay, good.
I got my eye on chat. Thank you.
Awesome. So here's some examples of some of those kind of challenges when it comes to doing surveys and just kind of overall when you're asking people things. You know, how often do you exercise? I love getting this question. How often do you exercise? So here's, you know, a sample: never, once a week, a few times a week, every day. And so you immediately go, well, do they mean this week, last month? Well, I was sick, I was out of town, I was traveling, you know, it was busy. So do they mean on average? Is there a time frame that you're thinking about? You know, I'm really trying. This week I worked out every day, but before that I didn't work out for months. Like, it gets really challenging to ask that kind of question. Have you ever experienced sexual harassment? Yes or no? You're like, whoa, how do you define that? Because that can be very dependent. If I say yes or no, if I understand what do you mean by the term, and if it's in a survey, it's not like I can ask anyone. So I probably would skip it. If I saw that question, I'd be like, I don't know what you mean, so I'm just going to skip it, because these are kind of words that really do need to be defined before you're asking questions about them. Are you a careful driver? I don't know what that means. It's not, sexual harassment has, you know, a legal terminology, but careful, that doesn't really have a legal definition. So I don't know what you mean by that. It could mean, you know, have you received tickets or fines or accidents, or do you speed? I mean, I have no idea. So that's just a terrible question. Same thing with, like, is your household food insecure? It's maybe words that some people understand what that means. I don't think most people understand what food insecure means. There could be some shame wrapped up in there. Do I really want to tell people that I'm not eating regularly or as much as I should? Household versus an individual. So everyone in my household, like, I'm a 21-year-old, my dad's 65 or whatever, like, am I supposed to answer for him versus me? So that gets weird. And even thinking about, you know, this last one, how many times over the past 24 months have you visited the library? That seems like really straightforward, right? You're giving me a time frame. You're telling me a library, but does that mean any library? Does that mean my own public library? Does that mean my school library? And then over the past 24 months, that's just a really long time to remember with any kind of accuracy how you've done that. So these are the kind of caveats when you're doing survey research and constructing these questions. But I'll get into more detail with that. I want to give you some samples. So maybe you still think, nope, we really want to do a survey. I understand the caveats. So when do you survey, and then who do you survey? So there are some timing issues to consider. Certainly timing during the year. Traditionally, whenever we want to do a survey of anything, community-based, we would not survey over the end of year holidays. So really nothing past the middle of November through the middle of January. Nothing would get released, and even into November, people get a little, you know, busy. So in terms of the year, we would stay away from that. We would typically also stay away from summer. Now some communities are like, no, we don't find that many of our folks are taking vacation, or they're here most of the year or whatever. So it's really dependent on your community and your particular organization or situation. But those are the kind of things that you might stay away from, is times when people are going to have, you know, the available resources to actually think about something. In terms of timing, if you're going to release a survey and it's going to be online, is there a better time of week? So I always stay away from Fridays and Mondays. Fridays, we just don't want to see something new coming in. And Mondays, we got to catch up on all the stuff that we didn't want to see on Friday. So, you know, online, I typically would do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday kind of thing. Is there a better time of day? It kind of depends on your audience, but I think I like pushing stuff out first thing in the morning, so it's there. Particularly if you're looking to get folks who are working, they might check their email before they go off to work, if they're at home, something like that. You could also think about doing it later in the day when people are going to check email, maybe from home after dinner, whatever that case is. So it kind of, you just have to know your audience of who's most likely to see it and when. I will say, having done many surveys over the years, most of your survey responses, and I mean like 80% of your survey responses, will come in the first day or two. if you're doing online, because that's when they see it and it's at the top of their email or whatever. And then you just spend the rest of your time trying to get, more. And then it's a trickle after that. So that timing is pretty key. You want to make sure that as many people see it, as possible. When you're thinking about timing, it's also, you have to gather certain types of information. So whether that's they need to know certain things before they answer, they might have to look at records or documents or whatever. So there may be some labor there that you have to consider. And you want to think about, what types of information do I really need to capture versus kind of looking at your administrative data or the secondary data that you have. So don't ask a question if you could answer it a different way, for example. I would try to limit the number of questions. If you don't have to ask it, don't ask it. It is incredibly cost effective. It can be, if you're doing online. If you're looking at doing, postcards or hard copies of things and setting those up, then you're not as cost effective. But then, the distribution also changes. So it can be really efficient to gather that data, but it does take time to develop the survey itself. We usually take at least a month to put together a survey, and that's kind of going back and forth. And I'll get into how to do that, as well as testing and then analyzing. So who do you survey? When we think about doing surveys, the big question to do is, are we doing a census or are we doing a sample? And we came out of a federal census not that long ago, which means everyone. If you're doing a community or an organization and the numbers aren't that big, I would try to do a census if possible. So if it's 50 or something like that, you can probably just do a census. You don't have to worry about sampling. But if you get into a situation where several thousand, you're probably going to have to come up with a sample. So you're just taking a subgroup of that entire group, but you just need to know, like, what is my census? So here, say I wanted to do a county-wide survey to make it easy. DeKalb County is about 100,000 people. We're probably not going to do a census survey for 100,000 people. We just had the federal census, so we have some of that information. We're going to have to come up with a way to sample that. And then if we do sample, it's probably going to be based on population size. So what are the larger areas in our county? And then what percentage of the county lives in the city of DeKalb? And then we're going to try to match our sample so that it's representative. It's funny when I flash around my arms and the light comes back on. So the kind of the next thing to consider is about representativeness. So you have to have a really good understanding of the community, the organization that you're surveying. So if 75% are women, half of them are over 40, whatever the case is, like, have a really good idea of who your community or your organization is, and then look at how then do we make our sample as representative as possible. It's never going to be perfect. In any research design, perfection is not the goal. You want to try to get as close as you can, but that's the best you can do. Realizing what I said earlier is that you're going to get generally more women and kind of the 40 and up crowd. So is it really important for you to get folks that are not in that demographic to be involved? And that's going to take the time, because it comes back to some of those barriers about why people participate is around trust, relationships, voice, that kind of thing. So we try to do a random sample to get to that representativeness if possible. So of all the households that are in your community, you can do this, in a bunch of different ways. You can look at addresses. You can look at individual households. If you're surveying, for your library, you can take every 10th patron, whatever it happens to be. You want to come up with some kind of sampling strategy so that basically everyone in the population has equal chances of being chosen as part of that sample. Now, that doesn't mean that all those people will participate. It just means that they have an equal chance to participate. And hopefully that you've created that sample so it is going to be more representative. Then you're going to have to work hard at making sure that those individuals can actually respond. What I see more so in organizations that attempt to do this is really a convenient sample. And I'll give you some examples. You know, if you have a bus transportation system in your community and they want to collect information, they want to do a community survey in their particular city or town or whatever it happens to be, and they're distributing that survey through the buses. So when you get on the bus, there's a card there and you can either pick it up or the driver hands it to you or whatever. That's a convenient sample because they're already there, right? If you're distributing a survey through a library and you have it at the front desk and the patrons that come in, you put one in their bag or you give them a bookmark and it has the survey on it or whatever, that's a convenient sample because they're already there. They already know you. You don't have to find them. They just happen to be in front of you. All good. Those, however, are not random, and they likely will not be representative because there hasn't been an equal opportunity to participate. If you're trying to ask people about, you know, library services for the people that use library services, then you're good because they're already there. But what you're not going to get is, you know, what services do you want? How do you rate our services against other providers? You know, that kind of thing. So here in DeKalb, they were a few years ago, they wanted to get input about the community pool that's here. And they were surveying pool users. And so they came up with some results. And they were like, well, the people here, they'd like this, this, and that. They have this, this, and that. And one of the trustees in one of the meetings said, well, this is great, but this just tells us about people who already use the pool. What we really want to know is people who don't use the pool. And why don't they use the pool, or why did they stop using the pool, et cetera. So convenient sample is one of those things you have to keep in mind. It is convenient, it is quick, but it only tells you about the people who already know you and who are already using your services. The other thing is to keep in mind with your sample is that you have non-respondents, and you have to think about that. So even if you do the random selection, and you're going to send your survey to those households or distribute that survey, there's going to be a bunch of non-respondents, and then you have to figure out how do I go and maybe oversample in that area. So if you have a neighborhood, for example, that's coming up, you really want to be representative of the whole city, but this particular neighborhood, no one's filled out a survey or no one's completed it. You're probably going to have to oversample in that neighborhood. So instead of taking every fourth resident, you're going to have to take every other resident, for example, because you're going to have, say, a 50% non-response rate in that particular neighborhood. You could also have a non-response bias. So for the people who don't respond, they might have very different views of the people who actually do. So kind of going back to my pool example, there maybe is a lot of people who would respond saying, no, the pool is way too expensive. I haven't taken out a summer pass, or I haven't done that because it's way too expensive. But they're obviously not participating. The people who do fill it out, they already bought the pass, so they think it's affordable because they already have it. So you're not going to get the same, the same responses because they're very different, your non-respondents from your respondents. So things to consider are if you're going to do online versus hard copy surveys, and again, you have to know your community, who's more likely to fill out an online survey. Their technical awareness, their technical abilities, their ability to have internet, ability to have a device, if it works on phones, tablets, laptops, PCs. If you're going to have hard copies, how are they going to be distributed and collected? Because then there's data entry issues. And you have to be able to read writing, plus the time that it takes to enter those. You can provide an email link if you're going to do an online survey. Most organizations are doing online. If you give them a link directly, then you know if they've completed a survey based on the response. So here at NIU, we use Qualtrics, and I'll give you some other ideas about what to use, but Qualtrics is one of them. I can load email addresses in there, and then I know if that email address has responded, so they don't get all my follow-up emails, please respond. But if you just send a link out, provide a link on, say, your website or social media or on printed materials, you don't know who got it, how many were distributed. So you can't really follow up. You can send out a mass email again, or a social media campaign to say, hey, if you haven't filled out our survey yet, don't forget, you have until Tuesday, you send it out again. You don't really have a way to track who's filled it out. So you can't really calculate a response rate because you don't know how many received it versus how many completed it. You don't know where they got the link from, for example. So you have to really think about kind of the ethics about surveying methodology, who gets left out of it. You could skew results by only, listening to the voices of this particular population and not the rest of the population that you're trying to get at. So there are some ethical things to consider in both design of the survey as well as analysis. You want to make sure that you do have those, if you want them to voice diverse voices and perspectives. You need to design a methodology to do that. And then you could work through community partners. So if you're an organization and you work with a lot of other partners, then you could ask them to help you distribute the survey to their members, patrons, which means someone could get the survey from 3 different places potentially, or see it 3 different times. So are you going to be able to allow them only to respond once based on, their IP address for their computer, for example? Is there another way that that somebody couldn't just take the survey 3 times? I mean, I think survey responses are hard enough to get, so I don't know why you would fill it out 3 times, but it is possible. So there are ways that you can kind of control that a little bit. So how do you survey? Most common now is certainly online. There are still some that will do mail. We have survey teams here at NIU, and I'm sure there are other places that still will do phone surveys. More challenging with fewer households having landlines and more people with call display that they just won't answer, but that's still something. You can do in-person surveys. So you're doing an interview, but it's you have survey questions and then you're completing it for them. And that might be something if you have a population that might not be able to do it independently, or need someone to explain the question, or translation issues, and you might have to do it in person. So you can do it as a survey, as a phone survey, as I said. You can make it pretty long, but people can always hang up. You can include short open-ended questions, but more so it's really going to be online predominantly. So in terms of online platforms, you have a lot of choices. SurveyMonkey is really popular. We use Qualtrics here. You can even use Google Forms. Ninja Forms is another one. I haven't used it, but that's another one I know my students have talked about. You can use Amazon Mechanical Turk. If you're not familiar with it, it's kind of like crowdsourcing responses. And there's even academic researchers that are being published now. In short, it's MTurk. They're using MTurk responses. So you're paying for responses, but you can really target your market. People voluntarily participate in these panels and they give all of their demographic information. So you can say, okay, I want engineers in South Carolina who are over 45 and play tennis or whatever. And then your survey will just go to them. They can still choose to opt out, but then you're paying for those individual responses. So it's just something else to consider in terms of this online world. It provides an incentive to the user, and it gets a very targeted response to the organization. So in terms of questions for surveys, you kind of have 2 options: open-ended versus closed questions. And then of the various types of closed questions, so open-ended just means you can, you leave a box or whatever, and they can type or write anything that they want. Those are very hard to interpret often if you can read the writing, but then you've really got to do more themes and qualitative analysis. Most surveys, and they take time, so generally those are the questions that people skip because they don't want to waste the time thinking and writing the responses. So in general, you're left with these kind of 4 types. Multiple choice is the easiest one. Choose from the following 4 things. Sometimes it's dichotomous, just yes, no. Again, they don't tell you very much. Are you a safe driver? Yes, no, kind of thing. You could have matrix or Likert scale, and I'll give you some examples of those. So multiple choice simply means you can select one or select all. If it's an online survey, that's in the programming side. So you can say, do I really want them to select all or select one? That's easy. There's often other, and then you might have a write-in category there. Dichotomous, so just yes or no. Do you have children in your home? Yes or no? That's kind of easy. You could have matrix questions. These get very complicated, especially if people are doing them on small screens or on phones, for example, because you have multiple columns and then long lists of things. which is what you see here. You know, what features do you like in these cars or whatever? So that looks really weird on different kinds of screens. Matrix questions are hard to, when you're looking at it online, to figure it out. But if it's necessary, you can use one of them. You just don't want to have a whole survey of them, because this really stretches people. You know, am I checking the right box? If you look at these particular questions, you can also lock down, like, can they only select one in those columns? Can they select any in those columns? So that's all what you do kind of on the back end. Likert scale, we're all kind of familiar with, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10. When it starts to get 1 to 10, I mean, it doesn't really mean anything at that point, because, like, what's the difference between 2 and 3? Not much. So I always keep them kind of short. Usually my Likerts are maybe 5. I don't think you need to go to 10. And you really have to remind people of what the scale means, because in our minds, you know, 5 is bigger than 1. So does that mean I agree more strongly with a 5 versus a 1? And you don't want to switch them as you're in the survey. So in 1, if you're doing a Likert, you want to use the exact same Likert scale in every question that you can, so people don't have to relearn the scale. So if you start with strongly agree, the next one you don't want to start with strongly disagree and make the scales go weird. So you don't want to change it, but those are kind of typical Likert scale questions. So survey construction is really that science and an art. You've already seen some of that in some of the questions that I've given as examples, that when you're thinking about doing a survey, you kind of dance between those two things. You know, so these are some questions about, they're not great questions. And so I wouldn't put them on a survey, but these might be questions that you're like, well, how can I ask that differently? Like, do you feel safe? So safe is one of those words, like affordable. I don't know what it means. It probably meant something different when I was 20 than it does now. So what do you mean by that? In what circumstances? Like in my home, in my car, in my work, while I'm walking after work, you know, whatever. Those get really tricky. So you'd want to really think about, what am I trying to ask? You know, if I was taking this, what do you mean? How do I feel safe? Could you ever see yourself going to therapy is a weird question. You know, and I just made these up for discussion purposes, but these are like, I never ask questions that are predictive. So would you consider traveling to the Bahamas for 2 weeks next July? Sure. Why not? So I don't ask future questions. In surveys, I only ask generally. If it's in the past, it's got to be a very recent past that most of us will have some idea of. Within the last week, within the last month is even a bit of a stretch. Surveys are really taking your pulse at a certain point in time. It's like taking your blood pressure in the morning. That just means what your blood pressure was at that time. Taking a survey is the exact same thing. What do I feel like right now when I'm taking it? That's what's going to kind of taint everything that I'm going to say. So if I had a really rough day at work and then I take this survey, I might even skew negative. You know, frame of mind actually matters. But when you're thinking about these questions, you know, you really don't want to ask about, would you, could you, are you willing to, might you? Those are all future questions. In general, humans, we're very aspirational. So could I? Sure. Would I? Probably. Have I? No. So you want to ask them about their current behavior, their current knowledge, their current practices. Again, you're just taking a temperature. How do you feel today? That's what a survey is good at. It's not good at assessing change over time or asking about why you feel that way or why you might do this. This question, do you feel that guns should be barred from school? And then those who bring guns to school should be punished. This doesn't have anything to do with my take on guns. What it means is that you're asking 2 questions in 1 sentence. And you never want to do that, because how am I supposed to answer that? Maybe I have 2 very different views on both of those things. And now you've conflated those 2 things in my mind. And now I don't know how to answer. Another couple of examples of questions, and I've seen these kind, you know, how many types of, how many times, that shouldn't be types, how many times have you experienced harassment in the workplace? When you see this scale in here, it should immediately jump out at you that there isn't a 0. Because if you're asking someone if they've experienced something, they should be allowed to put a 0, that it's never happened. And there isn't a 0 or a 1, actually. Then the numbers overlap. You never want numbers to overlap like that. If you're going to do 2 to 5, you should keep the same ratio. So that's 3 points. The next one should be 7 to 10. The next one should be 11 to 14. Like, you want to use the exact same numbers so that people say, well, yeah, I say 5, but now 5, that number actually appears in 2 categories. Now I don't know what to do with it. So I'll probably skip it. And then you have them jump. So the first category is 3 points of difference. The next one is 5, and the next one is 20. Like, it makes absolutely no sense. And then 30 to 50, there isn't one. And then it just says 50 plus. So those are the kind of things when you're thinking about, really check to make sure that those are actually, exclusive categories. Again, this is a futuristic question. How likely are you to not recommend this location? So you got to read that like 3 times. You're like, how likely am I not to recommend this location? Very likely, neutral, or not likely at all. So because of the negative is going to throw you off, how likely am I to not recommend this? So that's just a terribly worded question. Again, it's futuristic, but it's also worded in a negative. And then we really have to stretch the brain to make sure we're answering it the way we want to answer it. Have you ever experienced unemployment and applied for unemployment benefits? Again, it's kind of it's a double barrel question, so 2 questions in one. And the categories kind of don't make sense. Yes, no, sometimes, don't know. They're kind of odd categories. When you're thinking about demographic information, and often we want to capture that, maybe we want to capture it because of comparison. So comparing it to your population, but also to comparing it to your community. So you really want to consider using standardized variables. That means you want to match maybe an existing data source, like a data source that you already have, census data, whatever it happens to be. If you're going to compare it, then you've got to standardize those things. And that's imperfect, right? Maybe we would choose to use differently, but it is what it is. You want to make sure that there's no overlapping categories versus kind of check all that apply. If you want them to check all that apply, that's okay. You just have to be really clear. Is it check one or kind of check all that apply? We're seeing a lot of changes to sexuality and gender inclusivity questions on surveys. So you're going to have a discussion around what do we want to do with that? Do we want to make it, where we have more items under sexuality or gender? And what does that look like? Where are we going to borrow that language from, so that we can do comparison, but also so that we're making people feel comfortable, giving us that information. Race versus ethnicity, the census does break that out. So when you're thinking about that, is that something you want to do? If you want to track kind of where people are living, are you going to look at zip code data versus, writing in a city or using a drop-down menu for a city? Drop-down menus are nice if you're doing it on a laptop. They can be clunky if you're doing it on some kind of smaller device. I've seen some surveys where they actually use a visual map, like drop a pin, where you live or whatever. But there's lots of different ways we draw boundaries around demographics. So school districts is one of them. What school district are you in? And sometimes people won't know if they're in a school district or which school district they're in. So sometimes you have to provide additional information. There's lots of different political boundaries. So you could look at county, you could look at water districts, library districts, versus like villages and municipalities. They all have different boundaries. So when you ask people, they may know those things, they may not. So you're going to have to give them links or more information about where they actually live and all of that. And you want to collect this information because ultimately you want to make sure that the responses are in line with your overall community, and do you need them to oversample in some areas? So really think about when you put that survey together, think about language. So food insecure, for example, that's not necessarily common language. So what does that mean? Are we using current language that's really inclusive? Are we using definitions if we need to use definitions? But also then around different languages themselves, are you making it available in English and other languages that are spoken or read in your community, whatever they are in your community? Kind of think through the pace. This is kind of the art side. Are people more likely to, there's probably some varying opinions on this. Generally, we want to put some of the easier questions up front so people kind of get comfortable. And then you might put the harder questions near the end, but that also means they may skip everything that comes later and give you all the easy stuff up front. So think through the order of those things. As I said, if you're putting a bunch of Likert scales and you're going to mix around, you want to put those together, or do you want to separate them because they're so different? Who knows? You got to think through time it takes to read the question, answer the question, how long the whole survey is going to be. I think in general, we don't want to spend, 3 to 5 minutes is probably a long survey to fill out. So if you're getting up to 10, 12, 15 minutes, people are just not going to fill it out. They're going to skip. And if you have any kind of visual elements, can you use that to your benefit to get people to actually fill it out? Is the font size appropriate? Can it be read by everyone of all ages and backgrounds? You can also use you know, some ways to generate responses are using QR codes that can link directly to an online survey. Most people with a smartphone, they can scan that and it'll take them directly to the online survey. So that's nice. Not everybody can use QR codes though. So you've got to then think through, well, maybe a URL shortener like bit.ly or tinyURL. They might be able to shorten it because some of these, you know, the SurveyMonkey and others, they generate these really long URLs and then people have got to type that in, which gets clunky. So you can think about doing that as well. I'll give you some of these resources. Certainly, this is a nice small one that I like, Why Research Methods Matter, Essential Skills. There's a lot in there, but it's a thin book. It's more of a practice book. It's not an academic textbook or anything, so I like that one. And I'll share these slides with you, Sam. You can send them out whenever. So what comes after, as we're getting close to time, and then we'll have maybe some time for questions. What comes after the survey? After you've launched it and you think you have enough responses, you have to clean the data. So you gotta clean it. You gotta look for lots of different things. It's really to ensure that the quality is good, that the data that you have is as accurate as possible, that it's as complete as possible, and that you're consistent. So you have to do some things. You have to go through. Usually you download it into some kind of file, Excel, CSV, whatever, and remove any kind of weird things like age is 999. You have to watch for those kinds of things, like that just doesn't make any sense. But then you may want to see if it's really complete or accurate. So say you'll go into the survey and like somebody had tried to take it 4 times. So there's 3 blank surveys and 1 good one, for example. So you have to make sure you delete those other ones. And just comparing records and statistics between that uploaded data set and the original source, just to kind of double check with those things. So then who has access to that? Now that it's in some kind of data file, how are you going to protect it? Where is it going to be stored as a file, physically or digitally? So all those, if you had paper surveys, where are they going to live? Did you remove any kind of identifying information from that to make sure that an individual can't, be identified? So those are some data protection issues that you're going to have to consider, because it really can be an important data source. And if certain information maybe got out, then that would be harmful to the individual or the organization. So think through what your data protection kind of strategy is. And then, most people don't really like looking at spreadsheets of data. It doesn't bring them joy. So thinking through, how can we make this more visual? We have a data informatics group here at NIU, but you can also look at Tableau. They have free versions for nonprofits, or Alteryx. Alteryx is it's just a lot of fun, and you can play with it for a long time. It does some really cool data visualization, and even Canva, you can get some to allow you to do a little bit of infographics. It'll just make your data a little bit more user-friendly and accessible versus, just your standard kind of tables of things. And that's all my contact information. So I'm going to take a drink, and then I'm happy to answer kind of any thoughts or questions that anyone might have. And I'll stop sharing so I can actually see people and talk to people. All that good stuff.
Thank you very much. And
You're welcome.
I will give folks a moment to put their questions in chat.
Sure.
And I did have one come up.
Yeah.
For some reason, it's not letting me spotlight myself. It's very strange. So everybody just gets to look at you today.
Okay.
And I think you kind of addressed it, but I'm just curious. And it was about the demographic of the people. Just realized I have not turned on my camera, and that's why it's not letting me spotlight myself.
There you go.
I just really want everybody to see my little caricature. Anyway,
I love your caricature, by the way. It's really cool.
It's very fun. It's from an ALA conference. That was Reuters' like incentive to get you to stop by their booth, was they would do a caricature while you waited. Anyway,
love it.
Thank you. You do have one compliment from someone in Lake Forest.
Hello, Lake Forest.
So mine was about demographics and trying, like, so for example, in the Barrington area, statistically, we have a higher percentage of people over the age of 65 than other areas in Lake County, in the state, and so on. So the question I wrote down initially was, you know, do you weigh those responses then more heavily? And I think you kind of addressed that when you talked about oversampling, right? But then I can tell you, like, for example, my husband will never answer the question on a survey about household income, right? And if that's a
It's just his thing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Required questions, that you have to be very careful about those.
Right.
Because is it really required? Like, do you really want to hold somebody hostage over that? So
Right.
I generally put very few required questions, if any, because then people feel like, I can skip that. I'm okay with skipping it. I still get to answer all that other stuff. Like, I think partial responses are better than none.
Yeah.
So get partial responses if you can. Sorry, that was not your original question.
That's okay. Or I was going to say, or I like the ones that have prefer not to answer.
Yep.
Right? But in general, do you find that when you're asking those kind of demographic questions, age, race, that sort of a thing, does that reduce the number of people who respond to the survey overall?
I don't think so. So when I structure demographics, you can do it in a couple different ways. Most times demographics are at the end. And if they're really important, you put them up front, right? Or you kind of weave them throughout if you really want to catch people. That's the art part. You know, you think people are going to be savvy, you can weave them throughout versus leave them at the end. I try to just make it as easy as possible. So like if you're going to talk about race and ethnicity, like if you really want to use the full race and ethnicity question from the census, like it's 18 categories or whatever, like, is that really important when you know your community? Right. That you're going to get into 4 different types of Southeast Asian something, right? Probably not. You can collapse some of those so that it's not seen as a larger barrier because you don't have all those categories. So I don't think so. Anything you ask around income is going to be sensitive. So put broader categories. Like, I don't know what necessarily why your husband wouldn't answer this, but I would be curious to say, well, if we said, you know, broad categories, under 50, over 50, over 200, whatever, like broad categories, he probably would answer it. But if it gets too tight and narrow, like 100 to 125, 125 to 150, you're like, you don't need to know that. Right. You know, so you can kind of, it's the psychology of it too. If that's a barrier, I think definitely that's one way to go, is collapse some of those categories.
Okay. Then we did have 2 questions come in.
Yep. Nancy, got it.
Yeah, what is considered a good number of survey responses? If I survey 1,000 people and only get 30 responses, can I count that as representative?
No. Okay. That's a short answer. I mean, there is statistical tests to say, you know, are these representative or not representative by sheer numbers. 30 would not get you near 1,000. So, you know, are you trying to say that your 30 is generalizable to the whole 1,000? Then you have to be subjected to some statistical tests to see, is that actually true? If you just want to know if 30 people, you know, have heard of your organization, then 30 people will tell you if they've heard of your organization. It doesn't mean you can generalize it to 1,000.
That makes sense.
So that's where it gets tricky. If you're just, that's kind of more of like a poll than trying to get at representativeness. And are they the people who responded representative? So if you have a very homogenous community, I'll make that up, but if you're mostly white, mostly 45 and up, mostly college educated, it doesn't really matter if your sample is 50 or 500, you're going to come in close. But if you have a very heterogeneous kind of community where you have lots of different age, race, and background, that's where it becomes more critical to get a higher response rate, because you're not going to be as representative. But again, it depends on your community, how accurate you can be. What was part 2? Platforms.
2 is, it jumps down 1. So second question is, platform paid or free? SurveyMonkey is great, but very limited on the free platform. You recommended a few, but what do we look for when we're choosing a platform?
Yeah, I was using SurveyMonkey, the paid version of SurveyMonkey, because I think those features are worth it. You only get to ask a limited amount of questions from what I can remember, and only so many surveys and that kind of thing. So I would always do the paid. I do think they're getting better that you don't have to necessarily take the annual subscription. You can pay by month. So that's a way too, is maybe thinking about a month by month. I was using SurveyMonkey for so long, and then the university got an enterprise subscription to Qualtrics, and now that's what I use. Qualtrics is it's just different, so it's not bad, it's not different. I like that with the paid version, you can customize it more, so you can put your logo on it, because I think it goes back to that trust thing. If you're getting an email from info at whatever SurveyMonkey to fill this out, and it's got ads and it's got SurveyMonkey on it, you're like, maybe not. But if it's in your colors and your branding and from your email, even if on the back end it's a different platform, I think it helps to build that trust recognition. So I think the paid form is always better for those reasons. I think it drives responses even.
Okay.
Yeah. Was there one more?
And then there is one more.
Yep.
Try to keep your surveys brief. What do you think of doing 2 to 3 brief surveys in a year instead of one longer survey? Is doing multiple surveys in a year a bad idea?
No, if they're not, if they're different enough. So if you really want to get, say, information about your summer programs, I don't know, and you tell people every February we're going to send you out a survey about what we're looking for summer. That's nice, discreet kind of thing. I wouldn't send the same survey multiple times in a year, but if you could chunk it out, like one's going to be on programs, one's going to be on, outreach, one's going to be on marketing or something, I think that's okay. You're probably going to get the same people filling them out. They're probably not, because people who fill out surveys tend to fill out surveys.
Right. Which isn't entirely a bad thing, right?
Not entirely bad.
Sure.
And if it's short, they might do it quickly. Like I said, it's just got to be really convenient in order to get those response rates up. But yeah, I think doing smaller ones. And by the way, we also have terrible memories. So you're really not going to remember that you did this just 6 months ago, probably. If it's short enough, doesn't take that long. Yeah, I think smaller multiple surveys isn't a bad idea.
Okay, as long as we're not asking the same questions over and over.
Yeah, you don't want to feel like inundated. Oh, this is another one that's going to take me 12 minutes to complete.
Right.
Like just make my life easier,
Right.
Would your neighbor take it? Would your friend take it? Not you, because you care about whatever you're surveying about, but it's really a time you're not paying someone, but they're paying in their time, which is somebody has said this just recently, like it's really the only non-renewable resource. You don't get it back. So like make it worth my while.
Yeah, exactly.
or don't ask.
Right.
So write really good questions.
Right. Yeah.
Don't write questions that I don't understand, or I really have to just really think really hard, because surveys, they're not a great form of research. Like it's almost the default, but they're not great because of all the reasons that I kind of outlined. They're not great. Much better and richer. I want to always know, like, well, how and why, right? So the pool thing, when they sent out the survey to the pool, they sent out a terrible survey about this pool because they need to renovate it. So they sent out the survey and they're like, check all the things you would like in a pool, or whatever they said. Well, what are you going to say? Everything?
Yeah.
Like, why would I not? I want a spa. I want a diving board. I want a sauna. Like, why would I not do that? Well, of course, because it's just check, 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 check. Like there's low, right?
Right.
Checking
There's
boxes.
a price tag attached to it, for one thing.
Which is really hard to explain in a survey. Like the sauna is going to cost you an extra $5. The pool is going to, it's really hard to ascribe all of that and then do a calculation of, whatever. Versus maybe it's just better to do some community information sessions and gather input qualitatively and explain the differences. Like, what are the trade-offs?
Okay.
If we want to put in this, we're going to lose this. If we do that, we're going to raise this, or the whatever. That's much richer than like, what would you like at a pool?
Okay.
Everything. This is like a sidebar, but there's a retirement community here in DeKalb, and they're an accredited nursing home. So they have to send out this ridiculous survey that's standardized across the country. So they send it out, and they always get high marks, because generally if people like you, you get high marks on everything, even if they don't use the services. They're like, yep, they do a great job. You should ask if they actually use that service before you ask them to rate it, by the way. Don't ask them to rate something if they have no experience doing it. But it gets worse. So they didn't do that. They went through all of these services, and then they were explaining the results to us because we were helping them through strategic planning or something. And they said the only anomaly in all of this, because they were patting themselves in the back, like 87% satisfaction rates, and they were loving life on everything, pretty much everything. Even the pool that they didn't have.
Oh.
Right.
Oops.
Right. So ask people, do you use this facility, and then rate the facility, right?
Okay.
Have you used this, and then rate it? Oh, and don't put something on there that you don't have, because in generally people who like you will rate you highly, and they don't read every question. They're just like, yep, sounds good. Yes, 8.
Yes.
Yep, love you,
Okay.
whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the strangest question.
And one more about the Likert scale. I worked with someone once who said she had been taught that you should never put like neutral as an option. And I'd just be curious to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I don't have a firm opinion. I think some people who don't want to commit, they're like,
you would fall on that neutral part.
Right. Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion. So what does it tell you if 40% of the people are neutral about a service or a program?
They're probably not.
The reason when you go to interpretation, it just doesn't tell you much, right? You're forcing someone to have an opinion if you leave it out.
Okay.
And most of the time neutral is, I don't really care.
Right. Or
so if you interpret it as, like, I don't know, it's okay. I don't love it, I don't hate it. So if you want to force an opinion, leave the neutral out.
Okay.
If you want to know if 85% of the people are neutral about something, leave it in.
Okay.
Kind of depends on how you want to use it.
Okay.
I go both ways. I don't like forcing people to answer one way or the other. Like if they really don't disagree with me, then don't say that you do.
Right.
But it does come down to the interpretation factor.
Okay.
How are you going to interpret that?
Okay. All right. I have not seen any other questions come through.
Awesome.
So if anybody has them, this is your last chance to get them out there. Maybe one of these days soon, I'll have you talk about that qualitative survey.
Yes, we could do a little same kind of thing, but on the qualitative side. That would be fun.
Maybe my schedule is done through July, but maybe I think I have 17 ideas for August. So we'll see. 17. Okay, not literal, but still quite
probably 12.
Right. That thing.
You know where to find me, Sam.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
Anytime.
All
and I'll send these slides to you if you want to send them out.
I will. Thank you all very much
Perfect.
for coming, and you're again getting thank yous. So
yay.
Appreciate you.
And reach out to me if you have weird research questions. They're actually fun. So I'm happy to just have a quick email exchange anytime with anybody. And I will do a quick promo. I have not taken advantage of this myself, but I do get the newsletter from the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies. And I find it very interesting. They do a lot of webinars and just general. I know I have a kid who is doing a master's program in Germany on international organizations and crisis management, who wound up watching the program and actually shared it with a couple folks in her cohort. So see, you never know where the tentacles are far. Somebody's looking at the IP addresses and they're like, what? Yeah. So she probably watched it on YouTube later, but that's awesome. Yeah. Very helpful. But also you have students who are doing research, right? Yeah, we often try to get students engaged, undergraduate students engaged in research, and sometimes they're small projects. So if you have a really discrete project that you're like, I could just use it, you don't have to even use what the students put together, but just another opinion about how to do this stuff. The students do some of that. So if there's a project that you think of is of interest, we either will use it as a class project. So our research methods class we teach every fall. So it could end up as a research methods class. And sometimes it's just like, look at this survey and tell me if it's okay. Tell me what you think. Okay. That's easy. Talk about or revise, or we did this survey and we have no idea how to analyze it. Okay. Because it was put together by somebody else, or that person left, or whatever, and we're left with 17 Likert scale questions and 87 multiple choice, and we're like, it's way above me. So sometimes we'll have classes just do data analysis. It kind of depends on the scope, but yeah, reach out to me anytime if there's a project where you're like, we could use a little help and I don't know what I need.
Okay,
Anytime.
excellent. All right, thank you very much. It will take me
You're
a
so
little
welcome.
bit of time to get the video up on YouTube, but I will, and I will send
Awesome.
everyone who registered for the class an email, a copy of the slides, and Alicia's email address, so you can take her
Great.
on all those things she just offered.
Yes,
All right.
anytime. Love it.
Thank you all very much.